Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me live is Shaka Ssali himself, aka the Kawale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you today?
I am hugely terrific, you mate.
A warm welcome to you, all our Facebook followers are watching us from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka, the guy. Okay, today we are going to be talking about a number of issues, but we'll start in Southern Africa. Unprecedented events happening in the southernmost part of of the continent, South Africa. President Jacob Zuma has been asked by ANC, of course, the ruling party, to step aside. What do you make of those developments?
First of all, Paul, we're talking about democracy at work. It is very interesting that democracy, in as far as Africa is concerned, seems in fact to be at its best when you are talking about South Africa, which I believe was in fact the last part of the continent to be decolonized from Europeans or European power for that matter. But it is also equally interesting to see that the person of Jacob Zuma, otherwise known as Mushorozi, he's actually been administered his own medicine. Why do I say that? You know, back in 2007, 2008, when he became president of the ruling ANC, he championed the recall of the second president of the Republic of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. Could you believe that as we talk, he actually seems to be on the same page with Thabo Mbeki?
What goes around comes around. It's interesting that you talked about democracy at its best, and when you look at it right now, it looks more like a coup, not a democracy, because he was supposed to at least serve his term and finish at the end of his term.
It is not a coup, it is a democratic process. The interesting thing about South Africa, you have, for example, party constitutions. You have the constitution of the ANC, which happens to be the ruling party, and you have the constitution of the Republic of South Africa. And when it comes to the ANC, and Jacob Zuma is obviously an ANC card-carrying member. Mind you, until December last year, he happened to be the president of the ANC. When it comes to democracy, it comes to politics and what have you, as far as the ANC is concerned, when you are a president of the Republic of South Africa, you are subordinate within the context of the ANC to the ANC. And so the ANC as a political party, and it happens to be the ruling party, has the power to recall one of its members. Because, mind you, in South Africa, unlike most of the countries on the African continent, you are not elected directly as a president. It is the party that attains power that in fact appoints you by virtue of being the head of the party. And so in that context, it is not a coup. But when it comes to the constitution of the Republic of South Africa, Jacob Zuma in fact could ignore or challenge the recall by the ANC. So we have to wait and see what happens tomorrow, because he actually has up to Wednesday to respond.
If he doesn't respond, then they force him out?
Well, they may be able to force him, but they will not simply march to his Union House office or residence or that kind of stuff. They will rather probably go through the route of parliament. They will have to go through a process of impeachment. Or even, in fact, before you get there, you can actually get into a process that would end up in a vote of no confidence in the person of Jacob Zuma, who happens to be state president of the Republic of South Africa. The question is, does the faction within the ANC actually have the numbers? Do they have the votes? Yes, they can count on the opposition votes, but do they in fact have sufficient votes in order to have a vote of no confidence in him? Because mind you, this is not simply about Zuma. This is also about Zuma's colleagues within the ANC who have been eating with him. They are also likely to be affected.
Right.
This is about the ministers who happen to be part of the cabinet of Zuma. So it's not that very easy. He's probably playing hardball because he also knows that if he threatens, for example, that his part of the ANC will split from the ANC, that could in fact create some political problems, meaning that the deputy president, who happens to be president of the ANC now, Cyril Ramaphosa, may not in fact be leading a party that ends up victorious during the next year's elections. Because let's face it, the recent or last elections, especially in major urban areas, and we are talking even about Johannesburg itself, they were basically swept by the opposition.
Correct.
So their support remains in the rural areas. And it is in the rural areas where Zuma happens to have a lot of support. So it's not that very easy.
So what happens? What challenges lie ahead for Cyril Ramaphosa? Let's talk about corruption. Maybe Zuma is being indicted on so many different cases of corruption. There are critics out there who said that the incoming president is not immune from this kind of thing. How is he going to deal with that vis-a-vis the party stalwarts?
That is also, of course, an issue. But again, let's face it, I've also seen a lot of commentators, a lot of pundits, pretty much really exonerating the deputy president. Because let's face it, Cyril Ramaphosa used to be the Secretary General of the ANC. And in fact, he happened to be the favorite of Madiba. Madiba wanted Cyril Ramaphosa to succeed him as the president. But unfortunately, because Cyril Ramaphosa, like Nelson Mandela, except that unlike Nelson Mandela, who spent more than 27 years and a half in different prisons, but mainly, of course, at Robben Island, Cyril Ramaphosa never lived for a single day in exile. And as far as the ANC is concerned, the people who think they actually own the party, who have the sense of entitlement, they made their career in ANC in exile. They lived in so many different countries for several decades. And so essentially what happens really is that some of these exiles tend to be supportive of one of them. You are talking about Jacob Zuma. So Jacob Zuma commands support in the rural areas where probably Cyril Ramaphosa doesn't actually have support. So he has to negotiate with Jacob Zuma. He has to negotiate. He will not, of course, be in a position, given the fact that South Africa is a democracy, given that in addition to being a democracy, it actually has functioning, strong institutions. We're talking about one of the strongest judicial institutions in democratic South Africa. We're also talking about an independent or fiercely independent media. We're also talking about a huge percentage of the South Africans of European descent who control a lot of things and who have powerful cousins all over the world and what have you. And they come from a culture, at least during their time, even though it was apartheid, they were part of what appeared to be democracy among themselves. And so it's going to be difficult for Ramaphosa, for example, to promise Jacob Zuma that charges will be dropped, because they cannot be dropped. Of course, I heard that Jacob Zuma had wanted the ANC to be responsible for paying court fees and all that kind of stuff. And apparently that seems to be a problem. And he probably may also want Ramaphosa, as President Ramaphosa, to promise that once Zuma is convicted, for example, Ramaphosa will be in a position of immediately pardoning him, giving him a pardon. Just like back in 1974, here in the United States of America, you're talking about Watergate then. You had Richard Nixon, who was president. He had a vice president called Gerald Ford. They cut a deal so that Gerald Ford could actually become president and essentially pardon Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon did not even spend a second in prison, but he pretty much could have spent a lot of time in prison and frankly would have faced a lot of political humiliation. So I think there's going to be some kind of deal somehow that will provide some kind of face-saving situation to the ANC and Jacob Zuma, because let's face it, it's not just Jacob Zuma. The problem here, in fact, may be the ANC.
Okay. Let's move along. Let's cross over to East Africa. Let's start in Kenya. Interesting developments there. The Attorney General resigning, so many things happening. The courts system seems to be fighting the executive. Your thoughts? Again,
democracy at work in Kenya, especially when you look at the fact that the judicial system, as represented by the Supreme Court, found the courage and the confidence last year, September 1st, to annul an election that had supposedly been won by incumbent President Uhuru Kenyatta. And then, of course, you remember that initially President Kenyatta said that while he disagreed with the court, he respected its decision. But later, he basically went native and actually called the judges wakora in Kiswahili, meaning crooks, really, thugs, that they are not state officials who had been elected by anybody. So why could they probably, in his words, use of power to annul an election that he had supposedly won? Then he promised to figure out a way of dealing with them. And eventually, I think, some in the judicial system probably felt intimidated. In fact, there were some indicators that maybe that warning may in fact have been heeded, because let's face it, if you recall, a day before the fresh election, or the repeat election, which was October 26, a day before that, the driver / bodyguard of the Deputy Chief Justice was actually shot in Haringam. He was injured grievously. We do not know who actually shot that particular driver, but all the evidence that I have seen points to the state. And of course, the following day, you also know that that particular Deputy Chief Justice, was not able to leave her house because, in fact, she was detained, really, in her house in Karen. She could not even have unfettered access to her telephones, really. She could not even take a telephone and call the Chief Justice himself. And you remember that there were only two people who turned up, the Chief Justice and one of the judges, so they couldn't actually form a quorum. In order for that to be a quorum, they would have had to be at least 5 judges. It did not happen. And they were supposed to meet so that they could probably postpone the fresh election that would be held the following day. And of course, because there was no quorum, the fresh election went ahead, and you know, the rest is history. Very few people, in fact, turned out to vote. And you remember, of course, President Kenyatta getting the dubious privilege of getting like 98 point something
Why don't
of
we just call it 100%?
those who voted, actually. But let's face it, there are a lot of evidence that suggests that less than 30% may in fact have come out and voted. And so there is the issue of legitimacy. This is in fact where we are right now. And then you're talking about the Attorney General. The Attorney General is on record having said, if in fact the leader of NASA, the opposition Raila Odinga, would have to be sworn in as the alternative president or whatever, if he could actually take an oath, it would be tantamount to treason. It would be tantamount to treason, so that in fact he would actually be apprehended, taken to the courts of laws, and if he were to be found guilty, and there would probably be no doubt that he would be found guilty, then the punishment would call for basically hanging, really.
Death penalty.
You hang him to death, death penalty. So the fact that this man who made that statement, you are told he has resigned, probably means that in fact he has not just voluntarily resigned. He was asked to resign because he was in fact fired. I have heard from some sources that he was probably fired because he actually gave very bad advice to the president. There is also the issue of this opposition activist lawyer, Miguna, a man who was born in Kisumu.
Superstar. He was probably a superstar.
Yes, a man who was born in Kisumu. The last time I checked, Kisumu seems to be a major sort of urban area in Nyanza province in the Republic of Kenya. A man who clearly is a Kenyan national and therefore Kenyan citizen. And they have a constitution of 2010 saying you cannot revoke somebody who actually was born in Kenya. You cannot revoke or terminate that person's citizenship, because that citizenship, in fact, is a birthright. Because he had also another citizenship in Canada, the man who had been, in jail, I mean, in 5 different police stations, and there were 5 different court orders that he should be released and what have you. Instead of releasing him or taking him to the courts, instead they took him to Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, KLM, to Toronto via Amsterdam. When you look at the laws and the constitution of Kenya, there's no way they could probably have actually deported a citizen. They could probably have exiled him, just like communist countries, China and what was the Soviet Union used to do to some of their radical citizens.
Shaka, let's go to the comments. Let's start with, I think, I don't think this is one of your fans, but perhaps a critic. He says, a kid from Kabale, groomed and trained by colonialists to paint Africa as a bad continent. Your take?
Very interesting. As a matter of fact, he reminds me that when I was growing up in Kabale, I was actually having unfettered access to a stew that was a reflection of an educational curriculum that had actually been put together by colonialists. That in fact, I was being socialized to become a very good subject of the British Empire. You cannot believe it, but I did not appreciate the roots of where I came from. In Kabale, that's why I say I'm a Kabale kid, until in fact I physically left Kabale. I started looking back to Kabale when I lived briefly in Kampala and some other areas, and eventually ended up in the United States of America. You cannot believe that contrary to what that brother actually thinks, there is no way under any circumstances I could find myself putting down Africa. I am a person that happens to be very passionate about Africa. Very, very proud in as far as Africa is concerned. I'm very, very unapologetic. And frankly, I have to give credit to because the fact that I have in fact physically lived out of Africa. I have lived in America where people are so proud, and majority of them trace in fact their origins from other countries. And they remain very, very proud. And I am very, very proud of the fact that I can even associate, for example, with people like the late scholar, writer and intellectual who was born in Guyana, Walter Radney, who wrote the classic, How Europe and Developed Africa. And he wrote this, in fact, when he was at the London University, at the School of Oriental and African Studies. 1966, he goes and teaches at University College Dar es Salaam. He has to be one of those people that inspired a very young man called Yoweri Museveni, Yoweri Tibuhaburwa Museveni, who now happens to be president of the Republic of Uganda. A man like Kwame Nkrumah, for example, from Ghana.
Yeah.
Where did he actually develop his idea, his vision of liberating Africa? Right here in the United States of America, and in fact living also in Britain. So, by the way, it is a great opportunity if you come from a land like Africa, which was colonized by European powers. It is a very unique opportunity for you to live in its metropolis, to live in the heart of Europe or America and what have you, so that you can actually look at the contradictions that obtain, and eventually you begin to define yourself as who you are. And I have to say, to be very honest with you, I am one of those people that do not apologize about the fact that I am an African, very proud African, a man that is very, very passionate about where I come from, and that's part of the reason, in fact, where I often say I am a Kabari kid from Kabari. So I do not have problems with Africa. What I have problems with Africa is what I characterize sometimes the deficit of African leaders, the deficit of African leadership.
Shaka, let's go to another comment. This one seems to be favorable. Jean-Claude lives in Kigali, Rwanda, and he says he's a graduate of international affairs. He says, Shaka, why in this era of ours are we hearing of two presidents swearing in, especially in East Africa? For example, we have two presidents in Uganda, two presidents in Kenya. What does this say about the region?
I think the reality is that we do not have two presidents in Uganda. We have one legal president in Uganda, but there are a lot of people who find him illegitimate because they frankly do not believe that he won the election. That, for example, people went to vote back in 2016, and at the end of the day, they feel that given the dynamics or the political dynamics of the manner in which, for example, the Electoral Commission is chosen, in other words, the people who run the election, it is not something that they feel that they respect. It is not a commission that they feel represents their interests and what have you. They do not believe, for example, when it announces the election results, because they do not in fact feel that the results that are announced in Uganda, for example, are reflections of the will of the people. They feel that the results are reflections of those who count the votes, and therefore who have in fact been chosen by one of the people that is also a competitor. So when they have no trust in some institutions and what have you, it's understandable why they look at the reason why there should be a people's president. In fact, I have heard so many people tell me in Uganda that they have a people's president and they call him Colonel Dr. Chiza Besigye. You saw the same thing in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, on January 30th. You know Uhuru Park. You cannot believe how many people came there. I hear that there are probably, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but in fact there are some people who have suggested that you were in fact looking at more than 1 million human beings. And we have situations where you look at those optics and you compare those optics, for example, with those who actually graced the inauguration of the illegal president, Uhuru Kenyatta, at Kasarani Stadium, I have been told that the numbers or the optics that you see at Uhuru Park may in fact have been 10 times more than those who actually attended Kenyatta's inauguration. You had Jamahuri, for example, Jamahuri Day, I think it was December 12th. It was virtually empty. The president was basically addressing an empty type of, event. And yet, you have Raila Odinga, you have all those people voluntarily coming up, so the man has the following. He has the numbers, the other one has the power.
Interesting. Shaka, we are running out of time, but one quick comment from Frank Nwamanya. Is communism or capitalism, which is suitable for Africa? Communism or capitalism, which is suitable for Africa?
To be honest with you, if you asked me personally, I would tell you neither is suitable for Africa as I see it. What Africa needs, perhaps, is to borrow a leaf from the Scandinavian countries. We are talking about social democracy. You're talking about a country that puts its people, or countries that put their people at the center. So that, for example, they look at the fundamental issues of life. We're talking about education, we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about housing and what have you, and the things that really make life. In a society like in the Scandinavian countries, we're talking about Sweden, Norway, we're talking about Denmark, Finland, and some of the countries. We're talking about looking at those issues as rights, fundamental rights, not privileges. So I think that Africa is better off borrowing from that type of experience. Social democracy would be terrific for Africa, given its culture, given its the fact that you have this extended relationship, extended families and what have you. That is the right thing for Africa. It's not capitalism, which really glorifies the individual. It's not communism, which assumes that everybody is equal, and yet in reality, we know that that wasn't true in the Soviet Union, and that is not true in China as we see it today.
Shaka, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow it is going to be interesting. We're going to be looking at the role of an artist in African politics. And in this particular case, we're going to be bringing a gentleman called Bobby Wine from Uganda, who happens to be a Ugandan music superstar or megastar, and at the same time happens to be a member of the Ugandan parliament. Bobby Wine, he just finished an executive course at Harvard University's Kennedy School, and is going to be in the studio tomorrow interacting with the audience.
Well, I look forward to seeing you live or watching the interaction between you and that gallant Ugandan. On that note, thank you so much for being a great guest. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington. Thank you.